Thank you, Ambassador Shinoy. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure and honor to be with a distinguished panel and a very distinguished audience. Some may have wondered why Egypt is coming to speak about West Asia. One, because we look at our constituency as being half in West Asia, but the other, which people ignore, is actually part of Egypt is in West Asia. We're not only African, the Sinai is part of West Asia, so we have a claim that we have a right to speak about that region as well. But more importantly, our perspective, and when I say our, I mean I take the liberty of speaking on behalf of Egypt, although I don't have a formal capacity. Our perspective is we live in a finite world with finite resources, and we ultimately have to find ways to be inclusive and to manage them to the optimum benefit of us all. We have frequently been here, our leaders have frequently been here, and we very soon would expect to see high officials from India also visiting Egypt to talk about the perspectives of the region as a whole. I'm going to get to the point quite quickly and to address issues which I think are important for you to hear from a Middle Easterner, but also to listen to what you say in the period after that. A few months ago, we were actually quite optimistic about the trends in the region, although we were far from reaching resolution to any of them. We saw a shrinking of the influence of Daesh. We saw an emerging, although inconclusive, reconciliation between Palestinian factions. We also saw some progress and some optimism about the Yemeni conflict and positive developments in Sudan at the same time. All of these, frankly, were sources of optimism, or at least pushed us away from pessimism, but have not yet, regrettably, moved the region away from the precipice of the abyss. I would argue that since then, we continue to see very serious complications about the configuration of the region as a whole and its very stability. If one looks at the questions of identity in the and border issues about the Levantine area, and we look at the situation in Libya, where it is a case of a failed state in all of its dimensions, even though, as was recently stated by the very distinguished UN envoy Ghassan Salama, that there seems to be at least some interest in moving forward. I think it still is quite a challenge there. Same applies to Iraq, where we've had ups and downs. Ups and downs because of the moving away from a nation-state concept to a sectarian concept, which is very difficult to sustain in that part of the world, and which frankly is a source of instability, or could be a source of instability throughout. Now, as a Middle Easterner, I can very legitimately argue that many of our problems were caused by foreign interference in the past, and frankly, foreign interference presently. And there are many examples which I will not refer to. But in all honesty, having been a practitioner for a significant amount of time, blaming foreigners doesn't provide me any satisfaction, and it doesn't provide any solutions either. So while I will hold you responsible, I don't think the solution is simply by blaming you. I'm going to focus more efficiently, more directly on what Middle Easterners can do. And that's in many ways consistent with what the General said at the beginning of the comments. We have, in the Middle East, made mistakes. And I use the term Middle East, not only Arab world, because it involves both Arabs and non-Arabs. We have witnessed inefficient governance. We have not developed our national capacities to the optimal level. We have continued to allow the interference in internal affairs, be they by international players or be they by regional players. And my conclusion, which I put up front, be that the Arab world or the Middle East, Middle Eastern countries of non-Arab origins, it is time for a reassessment and their strategic change in our modus vivendi. We cannot continue to act as we did in the past and expect different answers. Let me start with my own community, the Arab world. And again, as a cautionary note, I tend to be quite candid in my comments, and I will be so both with my own community as well as the non-Arab members of the region. The Arab world has, as you all know, been traditionally very conservative. Nevertheless, 70%, 68% to 70% of our population is 35 years or younger, so it's a very youthful population. That is a challenge and opportunity. The challenge is that in spite of the vigor of the demographics, the highest rate of unemployment in our countries is among educated youth. That's a tremendous waste of resources. It creates a kernel for very serious long-term socio-political problems if it continues. Youth unemployment is just one of the problems that we face. The Arab awakenings of the last few years, as costly as they may have been, and frankly as unfulfilling as they may have been, ultimately were calls for engagement, calls for better governance, and they are calls that remain unmet. And these also should not be left unfestered. Arabs should recognize that the best way to safeguard your domestic interests, the best way to prevent parties from engaging or interfering in your internal affairs is to provide better reforms domestic for your own people, and that's the best way to safeguard the interest. Furthermore, I want to see Arabs more proactive, taking more initiatives rather than being reactive to events as they occur or to the interest of other regional states or international parties. We need to do that because ultimately the first concerned with the outcome of the future is our region itself. I would argue also that in our relations with international players, and we should continue them. I'm not at all calling for diminishing relations with the international players. Quite the contrary. We need to do more of that. But I would do more of that while at the same time also increasing our own national security capacity. That not only helps us defend against non-existential threats, but it also, frankly, creates a stronger political and diplomatic tool to address our legitimate grievances and reduce military conflicts. Let's build on past relations, but look at the future, understanding that it's going to be a different world. One example only, it is not going to continue to be, it is not any longer bipolar, and it does not continue to be Eurocentric. There was a reference to China. That's just one example. We need to look at the world differently. The very definition of power is different. And let me also highlight another point. With all of its weaknesses and all of its difficulties, the nation-state system, including in the Middle East, while imperfect, is far cry better than any religious or ethnic sectarianism, which will have a domino effect of instability throughout the region. So I caution against the ideas that, well, the nation-state system doesn't work in that part of the world, so let's divide it on a sectarian basis. That's not a formula that will lead to any progress whatsoever. I would argue also that Arabs need to be more proactive against hegemonic attitudes and illegitimate occupation of Arab lands. We cannot rest passive in that respect. To cut to the chase, we need to be more vigorous partners to non-Arab members in our region and to international players. In that vein, it is time for our leaders in the Arab world, and I'm not talking only about political leaders, I'm talking about, if you want, provide for better domestic governance for our own people. These, ladies and gentlemen, are no doubt momentous challenges, and they will take time to move forward. But I would argue that in spite of these challenges, this actually is an auspicious opportunity to achieve progress in the medium term, as difficult as the short term will be. The youth bulge, which I mentioned, is actually a catalyst for positive change and for development. It is, if it is properly invested in and fostered. Another trend to recognize is the increasing recognition by the peoples and authorities in our region that they need to be proactive with all of the challenges, mistakes, and pressures that brings to the fore. Thirdly, are the more vocal calls for accountability in the provision of goods and services. And I specifically mention goods and services because that transcends both the political services but also the actually efficient ruling of government. And I would add to that there is an emerging economic realism. One, that you cannot continue to live on natural resources. Secondly, that you cannot continue to live beyond your own means, and you need to actually focus on value-added economic policies in order to achieve the basic requirements of development. And fifthly, just to be concrete, there is a tremendous increase, especially in the Arab world, on infrastructural projects. And as much as I think the move into the future will be much more about technology, you cannot actually have a system effective, efficient economy if you don't have strong infrastructures. As I said at the beginning, while I started with my own community, the Middle East is not only Arab. And consequently, I want to also, with my same sense of candidness, deal with the other three countries that are traditionally looked at sometimes as being in and or out of the Arab world. In or out of the Middle East. Turkey and Israel have to decide whether they want to be Middle Easterner or extensions of the West. I can give you long, detailed explanations of all that. But ultimately, do you want to be part of the Middle East or do you want to be part of something else? Once you decide that, then that will define how you act and deal with your neighboring states. They have to decide, and I can give them the answer for that, whether they want to live with the region or at the expense of others in the region. The second alternative is not a peaceful one. Third question is the whole issue of identity, and that applies, frankly, also in some aspects in Iran. All three of these countries, which can have legitimate aspirations and ambitions, they have to understand that visions of regional dominance are ultimately a poison pill of self-destruction, and they should be very careful about pursuing that. The recent Turkish military insurgency in Syrian territory and territorial claims in Iraq are in contravention of international law. Non-neighborly activism in East and North Africa raises serious motivational questions. Iranian policies pursued in the Gulf area, in Iraq, in the Levant, and on the Mediterranean constitute interference in internal affairs of their neighbors. And as was said quite eloquently by former Prime Minister Signora, the Arab-Israeli conflict is the longest-standing conflict. And intransigent Israeli policies have increased. The propensity to repeatedly violate international law seems incorrigible, including land annexation and settlement activity. And there was another announcement today about further settlement expansions. Ladies and gentlemen, the resolution of the problems of North Africa have to be based on a national consensus that determines how different and divergent players will work together. The domestic players in Libya should confine their agreements to their national borders and be very, very careful not to directly or indirectly accept that they would be springboards for regional aspirations. As again was said by Mr. Signora, Lebanon is a very complex domestic paradigm, and he knows more about it than I do. But I would allow myself to suggest that the call for change in Lebanon, as difficult and as complicated and as complex as it is, ultimately is a call for better governance, looking towards the future, and if we can help them guide themselves to a consensual agreement, would frankly be tremendously to the benefit of the country, even if it does appear in the short term to be at the expense of certain parties there. Syria and Iraq have seen military violence subsiding, but neither of them seem to have stabilized, and that is a highly problematic area. And as, again, for an Egyptian talking about Yemen, we always hesitate, given past history, but that's an example of where domestic and regional policies have overlapped in a very serious sense, and it is now part and parcel of the geopolitical competition in the Gulf area between Arab Gulf states and Iran. I framed the larger areas in the Middle East, and let me therefore talk a little bit about the ominous deal of the century. The conflict is basically about opposing national narratives, trying to dominate alone one piece of land, or at least one party trying to dominate a piece of the land alone, at whatever cost that may be. International law continues to be violated. Land continues to be settled and annexed, and an apartheid-like environment is looming darkly with an unwillingness to accept the national identity of the respective peoples. This is simply unacceptable. National identity is a sacred right. It will not be bought and sold. Having East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine is not only a Palestinian goal, but also a position that enjoys popular support by the international community. The plan suggested begs the following question. Is there, by this plan, a real desire on the part of its proponents to reach a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or is its purpose to kill any opportunity to start serious negotiations? Because with the presumption of a real Palestinian state for its citizens, that would imply sovereign rights over land and resources within that country's borders, as well as its respect for Israel's right to exist in peace and security. And frankly, I don't see control over land or borders or even decisions within that borders. The new initiative, in terms of its projection of Israel's security concerns, goes far beyond any serious security concern on the side of Israel, especially if you look at the military balance that exists in the region. And it is more a reflection of an ideological desire to control the West Bank in its entirety, which in itself flies in the face against the idea of a Palestinian state. The proposed deal does not even provide a platform for negotiations. It is not going to be a basis for a solution that satisfies both the Palestinians and the Israelis. It is consequently both natural and logical that Palestinians reject to negotiate on the basis of this offering. Now, again, by way of trying to be helpful and out of the box a little bit, while I fully and unwaveringly reject the plan as submitted, I don't think simply rejecting is enough. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting amending the plan. The plan does not provide a basis for negotiations. But I think what's important now is for Palestinians to really engage in serious political and diplomatic reassessment and actions. They should, on the one hand, declare the creation of a Palestinian state under occupation based on the territories occupied by Israel in 1967. They should strive to achieve a unified Palestinian government. And then they should also call for negotiations with Israel under the auspices of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which of course includes the US but not exclusively. And they should express a willingness to negotiate with the Israelis on the basis of the 2002 Arab peace plan, which was adopted in Beirut, which includes both a bilateral and a multilateral regional context. So I'm all for the regional context, but not at the expense of the bilateral context. In this context, I would also suggest that the Palestinians further elaborate in a little bit more detail their position on the 4 paramount issues that have been the subject of negotiations throughout: the territorial compromise, Jerusalem, refugees, and security. Each one of these issues can be elaborated a little bit more without violating the basic tenets of the peace process. I mentioned 4 or 5 conflicts, and I would add before I move on very quickly that one of the things that's been bothering me about all these conflicts is not only their length and the vigorousness of the conflicts, but the fact that there is not a single Arab initiative to solve any one of them. And I find this to be hugely problematic as an Arab who has been in Arab diplomacy for all these years. It is time for Arabs to speak out vigorously, strongly, unwaveringly, but also to try to engage in solving these problems, because ultimately this is our region. So this is a call for Arab activists. But the Middle East is not only about these problems, nor are these the only problems coming up, and I will mention just 3. The shortage of water, extremism, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction are paramount issues as we look forward. If you look at North Africa, the Levant, or the Arab Gulf, all of these 3 countries, 3 areas, face serious water shortage, face an inequality in usage of water, and in the future, particularly with climate change, you're going to see much more of a problem in that respect. The second problem, which I want to raise very quickly, and I'm not going to use names because it's the trend that bothers me more than the name. Extremism, be that ideological extremism or extremism leading to violence, is another very difficult and dangerous trend as we move forward. We need to develop concepts and cultures that are more tolerant to each other, that deal forcefully with extremism, but at the same time deal with the environment that may allow for that to generate. Or, and I mean environment is not, includes of course education and our own language, but it also includes dealing with the regional problems. It was mentioned just a few minutes ago that if you look at the arms expenditure in the Middle East, our region has finally won. We're the highest level of military expenditure in the world in comparison to budgets. So if we wanted to compete on something, we've succeeded to be the best in that regard. That being said, we have the highest level of insecurity in the world at the same time. So I'm not sure it's the best use of our money. Therefore, we need to change how we look at security and how we deal with these issues. I want to simply close, and I do promise to close. One sentence. We need to do more as Middle Easterners, Arabs and non-Arabs. But we live as part of a world community. And if the world community is going to move away from the rule of law to power politics and the balance of power, that's ultimately very short-sighted. Now, rule of law is never going to be perfect, but there's no question that a fair, free, rule-based system applied without prejudice or preference is imperative for countries or regions that are generally made of countries of a medium size. The international system needs to move away from post-World War II concepts of a balance of, or the dominance of power, to a balance of interests. It won't be equitable. Let's not kid ourselves. It's not going to be equitable or equal. But the agreements and our practices need to be based on a balance of interest, not simply who is stronger in this day and age. Democratic principles, which I support in each of our countries domestically back home, in accordance with whatever model provides democratic concepts, have to be applied, but not only to countries. They have to also be applied to international practices. It cannot simply be that we are all stakeholders in our own countries, but we're not stakeholders of the world at large, even though we all claim to deal with the same resources. And finally, and that's my final word, and I'm not defending my former profession, as difficult and as unsuccessful as diplomacy has been, it still remains the best tool to use in international relations, first, second, third, fourth, before one looks at the use of force, be that military force or pressure, in terms of force. So I would really encourage that countries reprioritize their options, looking strategically at the world order, looking at the rule of law, and looking at diplomacy as their tool for international practice. Thank you very much.